Folks, welcome back to another episode of Mayhem in the Midsouth. Today we're going to be talking about poison pastries. Folks, when you have a murder case and it's so big and so controversial and so unbelievable that they make a movie about it, and when this movie was made, it had Farrah Fawcett Majors, Catherine Ross, Sam Elliott, and Andy Griffith in it. So you know it must have been a story of hijinks for sure. And I'm going to tell you folks, this story, I'm not going to be able to go through the whole story with you, but this story sounds like a work of Hollywood fiction, but it's not. It is very true. Now, there was a young lady named Joan Robinson. Now, she was a socialite, an equestrian, and I mean a very famous equestrian, and she was from Houston, Texas. Now, she had been adopted when she was just an infant by an oil tycoon and his wife. So as she's growing up, she's learning to ride horses, and she is just better than the average bear at it. She wins all kinds of national titles. In 1957, she marries this fella. The fella's name is Dr. Joan Hill. So they get married, and he is a plastic surgeon. In fact, he's one of the leading plastic surgeons, and so they were quite a power couple. Now, after about 11 years or so of marriage, things began to get a little rocky for the Hills. Now, Mr. Hill, he decides that he's going to have a little extramarital affair. I don't know if this was the first one or not. This is the first one that was put to print. So anyways, he's running around with this lady. Now, it's not too long after that, Dr. Hill decides he's going to divorce Joan. So he leaves a note for her. Says things just aren't good between us. So now she tries to call and get a hold of him, and he doesn't return her calls. And now her daddy, the oil tycoon, he says she needs to get a private detective and find out what Dr. Hill's up to. But now Joan was against that. So now a few weeks after he's left her that cryptic note about things aren't working too well, he comes out, Dr. Hill does, and tells his wife he's been having an affair. Now, he claims he's been blackmailed because of it. Now, I don't know who would be blackmailing him. In November of 1968, Dr. Hill, he serves divorce papers on his wife. But now Joan, she tells her daddy she still wants to make the marriage work, despite everything her husband's done. So she contests the divorce. Now, two of Joan's friends, they've been staying at the house. Things that they would testify to later would come back to haunt Dr. Hill. So, alright, so finally, the couple gets back together. So Joan is happy she's won her husband back. So he's back at living in the house again. Now Joan's two friends are still there. They've been there a few weeks. And what they would testify to later is that Dr. Hill would bring home pastries, but that Dr. Hill would decide who was going to eat which pastry. And they said they thought it was funny because Dr. Hill would be at the house, he'd get a page, he'd leave the house, Then he'd come back with the pastries. And now Joan would also tell her two friends that one night her loving husband had given her some kind of pill and it really knocked her out. So the next day, she's not feeling good. She can't even get out of the bed and she's vomiting. So now Dr. Hill, he tells the two friends of Joan that he's going to go out and get her some medication. Well, he ends up, Dr. Hill does, he takes his son and the two women out for dinner. Joan can't go because she's sitting there throwing up chunks of her lung, basically. She's very sick. And Dr. Hill brings her back some orange juice. Then he leaves the house. So now Joan, she is sick and she is constantly throwing up. So 2 days later, she's still sick. Now the two friends of Joan, they decided they're going to leave. And Joan tells them she feels dehydrated. And they get her water and they talk to her and they go on and leave. And she said that's fine. Now they got a maid. Now the maid, she's told by Dr. Hill that Joan, Miss Hill, is sick and not to be disturbed. So now it's March 18th. So now it's been 3 days since she's been sick. Now, finally the maid, she's going in there to check on Joan because she's, something's going on. She's been working for the family for a while. She's going to go in there and check on the missus. And this is after the doctor left for the day. Now she finds that Joan is in a soiled nightgown and she helps her change clothes, puts on a fresh nightgown, and then she sees that Joan's been laying in dried feces. So nobody's been waiting on Joan except the husband. And the only reason the maid's able to get in there is because he'd left. And the maid notices that there's blood in the stool. Now the maid, she notices that Joan's face is turning blue. And she calls the husband. And she can't get a hold of him. Now, Joan's mama shows up out of the blue, luckily. She sees that Joan has soiled herself again. She's vomited. And that there's the husband, Dr. Hill, just standing at the foot of the bed watching her, not doing anything to aid or comfort. Now, the mama, she figures out her daughter's got a fever. So now Dr. Hill tells the mom-in-law that, you know what, we better take Joan to the hospital. Now, he didn't call for an ambulance. And this has been going on for over 3 days. And now Joan has went semi-conscious. So Dr. Hill, he says, no, I'm going to drive her to the hospital. Oh, that's a good idea. Okay. Now, he doesn't pick a hospital close by. And Houston's got a lot of nice hospitals because there's a lot of money down there. So there's a lot of medical centers. Now, he doesn't pick any of these well-known hospitals in Houston. He picks out a brand new hospital, Sharpston General Hospital. Now, it's a 45-minute drive from the house. The hospital didn't have an emergency room or an intensive care unit. So when they finally got there, which is an hour or so, a nurse had to come out with a wheelchair to take her into a private room. Now, while they were driving to the hospital, Joan had told her mama she was going blind. Now, Dr. Hill, he tells him he says it's just called blackout. Now, Joan's blood pressure is 60/40. And the nurse, she does it again. She takes a second reading because she says there's no way that's accurate. She figures out it's the real deal. So she thinks that Joan's going to go into shock. So they bring a doctor in. Now this doctor was named as the wife's attending physician by Dr. Hill. Well, come to find out, he wasn't her physician. He only knew her from some parties they'd attended. So he drives over there to the hospital. Now, Dr. Hill tells this doctor here that his wife's nauseated, vomiting, diarrhea. Now, initially, this doctor that's going to start trying to treat Joan, he thinks it may be influenza, which we know is the flu. So now he orders an IV started on her, and he's now thinking that maybe it's just food poisoning. Now, the doctor, he's worried about his diagnosis, so he calls in another doctor. The second doctor comes in and he says, no, she's in septic shock. So they order blood cultures, and that takes 3 days. Well, then her kidneys begin to fail, and she's not passing urine. And they can't get her kidneys to start functioning. So then her kidneys just totally fail. So then they bring in another doctor. This is number 3. And he tells them, yep, she's in severe kidney failure. Now, they don't have a dialysis machine at this hospital. They talked about transferring her to Houston Methodist Hospital, where they've got such equipment. Then they decide she's too ill to be transferred. So then they start dialysis, peritoneal dialysis. Now, they have to call Dr. Hill at the house because he's not at the hospital. I'm sure he's too busy to tend to his dying wife. So they finally get a hold of him at his house at 9:15 in the evening. Now, Dr. Hill, he says, okay, I'm coming out to the hospital. So he doesn't give him verbal consent. He's going to give it to him once he gets there. Well, it takes him an hour and 45 minutes to get to the hospital. So he gives consent. Now, the wife is conscious again, and she is obviously very afraid. Now, at 2:30 a.m. on March 19th, the nurse is checking on her, checking her vital signs, and it looks like she's going into heart failure. So they call a code blue, and they bring in the cardiac equipment. Now, she raises up in the bed, and she's trying to talk. Sounds like she's saying her husband's name. And then blood just gushes out of her mouth. And they inject her heart with adrenaline. It doesn't do any good, and she's dead. Now, state law in Texas at the time said you got to have an autopsy before you do any embalming, or before the burial can take place. And that's for anybody who's died in a hospital within 24 hours of admission. So the attending physician asked Dr. Hill, says, talks to him about the legal need for the autopsy. Well, Dr. Hill, he gets a local funeral home to come get his wife's body. This is less than 4 hours after she's been dead. So the funeral home comes and they get the body. Now, within an hour of them taking Joan's body out of the hospital, they started embalming her body. Now, the pathologist, he gets to the funeral home a few hours later to do the autopsy, and he finds out she's been embalmed. Well, obviously, he's not too happy about that, but he went on and did his autopsy. Now, he couldn't really find any signs of anything wrong with her that he could figure out that would cause her death, other than the maroon coloration of her pancreas. So he says, well, she probably died of pancreatitis. Now, Joan's daddy didn't take that too well, and he doesn't believe that she died naturally. So now the daddy, he goes to the district attorney's office, and he says Dr. Hill has killed his daughter. Said, he murdered his wife. It's my daughter, and I want you to do something. And he tells the DA the circumstances of her death and the autopsy. So then the DA, he gets the Harris County medical examiner to go to the funeral home and examine the body. So he drives to the funeral home and he checks on the body. Now, the second autopsy said it ruled out poisoning. Said in his opinion, probable cause of death was focal hepatitis. So, of course, now the DA reads this and he says, well, I don't have a case. Now, the daddy, he ain't taking that. He's saying there's something wrong here. He's murdered my daughter. So then he hires him an attorney and they petition the Dr. Hill to give him permission to exhume Joan's body, which has now been buried. And Dr. Hill tells him, nope. So then the daddy, he hires the chief medical examiner for the city of New York. And he hires him to come to Houston. He wants him to examine the body. So they go to the grand jury, and the grand jury orders the body to be exhumed so they can do another autopsy. This will be autopsy number 3. Now, 10 doctors did this, or were involved in this third autopsy. And they even took that New York City medical examiner. They deputized him as an acting Harris County medical examiner. Now, they examined the body for 7.5 hours. He went back to New York for tissue samples and said he'd get back with them with his results. Now, according to him, after he's looked at all these samples, he says that Joan suffered a massive infection from an undetermined source. But because the body was embalmed before the initial examination could be performed, that there's no way to know exact cause of death. So he listed probable cause of death as meningitis or sepsis. So everybody is smelling a rat, but they can't prove it. Now the daddy, Joan's daddy, he's still on the DA about launching some kind of murder investigation against Dr. Hill. So they convene a grand jury. They can't get an indictment. So then they get a second grand jury and they exhume the body. And then they bring in a third grand jury in February of 1970. Now, the second ex-wife, the one that had been seeing Dr. Hill when he was married to Joan, she tells the grand jury that Dr. Hill had told her that he had killed his wife. And she says, oh, by the way, he tried to kill me when we were married. Now, the DA is pretty sure that Dr. Hill murdered his wife, but they don't have any evidence to indict him. So they come up with the idea, well, you know what? We could try him for failing to provide adequate level of care, which resulted in her death. So the grand jury votes 10-2 to indict Dr. Hill for murder by omission, meaning that he willfully, intentionally contributed to his wife's death because he had not given her sufficient medical help. Now, the state of Texas had never previously indicted anyone on a charge of murder by omission. So the murder trial starts in 1971, February 15th to be exact. And they bring the ex-wife, and she testifies. And she starts telling the jury and the court about Dr. Hill had tried to kill her as well, crashing her car into a bridge, injecting her with a hypodermic with some unknown substance in it. And she goes on to say that Dr. Hill told her that he had killed his wife by lacing pastries with infectious bacteria, and that she had seen the petri dishes in his little bachelor pad where he was growing his bacteria that he used to poison his wife. So now, unfortunately, when she says all that, Dr. Hill's attorney stands up and goes, Your Honor, I ask for a mistrial. My client's being charged with murder by omission, And now we got a witness saying that he murdered her by poisoning her. So that's not by omission. So judge says, you're right, declare a mistrial. So now they're going to have a second trial. It's going to start in November of 72. During this thing happened, September 24th, 1972, Dr. Hill is shot to death by a masked gunman during a burglary/robbery at his mansion with his third wife. Now they end up locking up a fella in April of 73, and he decides to confess. Of course, he only does that after they have a witness testify that, or give a statement that, yeah, they saw him there. So he goes on and he rolls over and he confesses. And he said he did it for financial gain. And a madam of a house of ill repute have offered him $5,000 if him and his prostitute girlfriend would go kill Dr. Hill and make it look like a robbery. Now, he didn't know who gave that money to the madam to give them to do the killing. But as you might guess, everybody's figuring, okay, Joan's daddy, the rich oil baron, he's disgusted with the justice system, so he's done went another route and he's done kicked up some money. That's just the talk around the campfire. The main players in the homicide, the madam who did the hiring and the shooter and his girlfriend who was the getaway driver, they're not in custody. But a grand jury indicts them for first-degree murder. And they indict the madam as an accomplice. Now the shooter, he's done disappeared. Turns out he's moved down to Longview, Texas. He's got an alias. Well, the police down there, this is a small town, they're suspicious of him. See a new fella hanging around. So a policeman goes over there to the cafe and confronts this fella, the shooter. Now, according to the official report, the shooter, he pulls out a gun, and the police shoot and kill him. Now, the remaining two suspects, defendants, they're found guilty. The prostitute getaway driver girlfriend, she gets a 10-year sentence. She does 5. Then they parole her. Now the madam who dished out the money, she got a 35-year sentence. She died in prison in 1986. So now we've got Joan, who's dead. Primary suspect in her death is dead. The man who shot and killed the primary suspect, he's dead.